Hi, and welcome to my Floss Tube channel. I'm jeanfarish, and I'm so glad that we get to have this time together. Now, last week you didn't see me because I decided to take an unplanned but very much needed weekend off. And I took naps, and I read, and I stitched, and I just really recharged my batteries, which was something I didn't know how much I needed until I got through the process. So here I am, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to go again. So I want to start by talking about my newest sampler, the what's going to be the Bighorn and Eagle sampler. And this is one that's being done as a stitch-along project for the upcoming Redwoods, Rails, and Wineries trip. If you've been following me on Instagram, which is very new for me, the whole Instagram experience, so I'm sort of getting my, getting my sea legs under me for that whole experience. So I'm not sure I'm doing a really good job with it, but I'm trying. So anyway, what I started doing on Instagram was showing my progress for this sampler, first in 30-minute increments. And then as I got down here and started working on the bighorn sheep, I realized 30 minutes just wasn't enough time each day to be spending on this, so I upped it to an hour. But what's been interesting about that is that it gives me an opportunity to really demonstrate to non-stitchers just how much time these enterprises take. And frankly, I think that my design style lends itself to a little faster pace with stitching than some others. If I were doing a full coverage piece with lots of confetti and 100 colors, I wouldn't be able to stitch anywhere near as fast as I am with this one, which I think has like 20 some colors in it. Anyway, now that I got the big guy done, I can really relax and start working on some other things. So my next enterprise is going to be working on the quote that's going to fill this area. I had to work in this kind of unorthodox way of working down just the left-hand side because I needed to make sure that I had stitched a little bit with each one of the colors that I plan to use so I could get my order in to my wholesaler and get the floss here in time to make the kits and get them ready to pack for the trip. So this is the one that we start in San Francisco. It's like October 15th. We will be gathering in San Francisco. Actually, I'm doing the overnight train from Denver first, but so that this trip actually begins in San Francisco. We're going to the Napa Valley to do the wine train. We're going to Yosemite. We just have a jam-packed week of fun and great scenery and some really fun stitching projects. So there's still room on this trip. So if you are so inclined, take a look at the details, and I hope that you decide to join us. It's really going to be a fun trip. One of the things that came to me during last weekend when I got a chance to really sort of relax and sort of just let myself be creative and not think about deadlines and whatnot. And interestingly, in that process, the idea that came to me was that I really wanted to make some sort of a beginner primer through video. And I'm going to start working on that. And much of what I think I'm going to be doing is kind of making snippets within these episodes and then taking them and editing them to become this primer. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And I was really surprised when I started making my list of the topics I needed to cover, just how complex our craft can look to a beginner when they're unpacking the whole idea of how do I do cross stitch? Where do I begin? How do I do this? How do I do it in such a way that I can truly enjoy it? So look for that as we're going along. And as always, I am very interested in getting feedback and ideas from you about topics that are important to cover for beginners. And as you know, I've got some pretty clear opinions and build on my own experience as far as the sorts of things that I want to cover and the way in which I want to teach. So anyway, that's my very big idea, and it's I think it's going to be good. So we'll see. So the topic I'm going to start with is floss. What is floss? How do we use it? Where does it come from? What are the brands that are out there? And build on that, because that's certainly the most common thing we have in terms of our craft. Now, because this is for beginners, I'm not going to talk about variegated. I'm not going to talk about overdyed. I'm just going to talk about just the solid color 6-strand floss. And what I have here are 2 skeins of what we refer to as 6-strand embroidery floss. The DMC brand is probably the most common here in the US. I have not used it for the last couple of years, so frankly, I don't know how old the skein is. The packaging might be slightly different from what you would see in the stores. This is the brand that I am currently using in all of my stitching. It's called Cosmo, and it's made in Japan. The DMC, as far as I know, is still made in France, in a lovely region of Alsace-Lorraine. So both of these are what I would consider high quality flosses. They are both 100% cotton. They're both 6 strands. Now, there are some flosses that are 4 strands, and there are flosses that come on spools. In fact, a recent addition to many stores' inventory is the Anchor brand, which is also another good major brand of floss. And it's coming on a spool that reminds me very much of just a spool of sewing thread. It's also a 6-strand, 100% cotton floss. Anchor's also a very good, well-known brand. So let's talk about these 3. One of the things that often sort of throws beginners for a loop is kind of unpacking the skein and how you use it and how you store it. And so I'm going to sort of take you through some of those steps. So one of them is how to get the thread off of these skeins. And one of the things that initially kind of annoyed me about Cosmo was they had these long tails. So whenever I was doing a photograph of my flosses, I would end up like tucking it under there or whatever. But what I realized is that they're giving you a very clear clue as to where to pull the skein, pull the floss out of the skein. So what you want to do is just gently hold it and start pulling from that end. And you can see just how easy and smooth it is to pull that floss out of that skein. Now, the DMC, if you will pull it from the end that has the number on it, you'll have the same experience. You can just start tugging and it will, well, there we go. And it will just come right out. So same thing. So the first thing is, and then the anchor is secured by a little slot in the top of the spool, just like a sewing thread would be. And you can undo it and just unroll. So one of the questions is, how long of a thread should you be stitching with? I would say that in your needle, when you're ready to stitch, 16 inches, 15 to 16 inches is a good length for a beginner. Now, later on, we'll talk about different ways to start each strand. And I will just say right now that later on, we talk about the loop starting. You will want to double those lengths and have the length that you pull off of your skein or your spool to be 32 inches long. so that when we fold it in half and start stitching with it, we end up with a 16 inches. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about the different flosses. Now, as I said, each one of these is a 6-strand floss. So let's unpack that. So when you tap the end of it or just gently tug it apart, what you see are 6 distinct threads. Let me come in closer here. So each one of these is considered to be a strand. So this is a 6-strand floss. This is 1 strand. This is 2 strands, etc. Now, how many strands you stitch with is going to depend on your project. The last thing I want to show you here with the actual threads is that this is a 2-ply strand. So if I untwist this, you can start to see where it's 2 threads twisted together. So those are 2 terms that I think helpful to know. The plies are the number of threads twisted together to make a strand. All right. Now, before I leave the subject of flosses, let's talk about the next step of how to get the number of strands that you need to stitch with. So I'm just going to cut a fairly short length here from the spool to show you how I do this. So when you have the 6 strands right off the spool, right out of the stand, they're pretty tightly packed in there together. So what you want to do is tap the end, which will separate them. And then let's say, for example, if I want to stitch with 2 strands, which is probably the most common number of strands called for in cross stitch. Grab one of the strands. Then I'm going to very gently but firmly hold the 6 strands between my fingers and my thumb and just pull this out. Now, as I pull this, I think I better back up my camera a little bit here. Okay, so as I pull this, you'll be able to see that the part I'm got under my thumb is beginning to sort of bunch up. And that's okay, don't worry about that. Just keep pulling that out. And as you do, when you finally get it through, the rest of this will just release. You won't have a mess. So again, you're tapping the end and you're pulling your strand out one at a time. Now, if going back to that loop method, which we'll get to in another segment, you would only need to pull out 1 strand, which we will then later on fold in half to stitch with 2 strands. But if you're stitching with 2 strands, you're going to pull them out and lay each one out. And you'll be able to then thread these 2 strands into the eye of your needle, and you will be ready to go with your first cross stitch project. So that is our floss, and I think that that's about all I really need to tell you about this important building block for our craft of doing counted cross stitch. Now, as I said, this whole thing with the anchor floss on spools is a relatively new thing here in the summer of 2021. And I found this at my Michaels store. I have seen posts on Facebook that it's also available in the Joann's chain. My local Joann's did not have it when I shopped last week, but the Michaels did. And so here's what the display looks like. And I feel like it's pretty well done, and there's a nice array of colors. But here's the thing that's already come up in the various chat rooms is now that I've taken my 2 strands off the spool to stitch with, what am I going to do with the other 4? And this is a chronic question that comes up, whether you are storing your floss in bags or on bobbins, or as I do on thread drops. What do you do with your leftover threads? And I will just say that I think that what I would do initially, until I figured out something better with a spool, is to just fold it in half and bring it around. Now this is a fairly short piece, so I'm probably not being fair here with my demonstration, but I would then just pull it through like this and just tug it. I really don't know what else to do. I'm sure somebody will come up with various ideas. I don't know what the solution is right now. But I will tell you that this question of what to do with that extra thread, as well as pulling out single strands, is why I really like thread drops. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but I'll get into it more now. Now this is the floss I'm using for the for the Bighorn and the Eagle. Now you can see that my navy thread is kind of sparse here. It's because I didn't start with a full skein, but these others I did. So first of all, let me tell you why I have them knotted up like this. When I'm not actively stitching with this, I like to put the excess floss in these kind of loose knots. I just do an overhand knot and just pull it through like this. And I do this so that it doesn't get all tangled up. And so you can see I kind of have color families done here. And the navy I had out because that was the last one that I was stitching with. But let me show you why I really, really, really love this storage system. Okay, let's say, for example, I'm stitching with the lightest of the 3 pinks. What I've done is I've labeled each one of my thread drops with the brand, because I also have other brands of floss and threads that I use. That's the color number. And then this is the symbol. So this one, the symbol's 9. This one is a star. And I do the symbol in pencil because I tend to use the same colors over and over and over again. So when I'm done stitching with this, I'll erase that and put the new symbol in. So when I'm stitching, I simply take my needle. Now I've got, this started out as all pieces of 6-strand floss. And like I say, it's about 32 inches long, so that when I fold it in half and start with my loop method, I'll be stitching with 16 inches. But what I love is I can just pick up a single strand with my needle and just pull it out. And as I do, this is all going to bunch up, but see, it just relaxes right away. So here I have my single strand. I don't have the other 4 or 5 or 3 or whatever strands to wonder what to do with. And so that's one reason I love this storage system. The other is that if, let's say I pulled that off and I realized it's not the color I want to stitch with next, or I'm baking brownies and the timer goes off and I'm not going to be able to stitch right now, I need to go into the kitchen. What I do is I take the leftover and I just put it right back onto the thread drop. I just, make a big loop and put the other ends in it and just pull it through, and there it is. Now I also do that with a leftover piece, and so you'll see this on all of mine. I might end up with other pieces just stored right on there. So when I next need to stitch, if this piece is going to be long enough for what I want to do, then I just use that one rather than taking a fresh strand out. So these are 2 of the reasons I really like thread drops. The other reason is the way I store them when I'm all done. So again, what I have here is all the colors I need for a single project on one nice big ring. When I'm finished, what I do is I put, like, this is all, here are the 700s that I have used in other projects. Here are the 100s, and the 600s, etc. So I put each color family, it's not a color family, a numerical order of colors. Now, I could also do it by color family, but I find that, like, if I know I need, let's see, 663, I know to go to this ring where the 600s are. So that's why I do that. And then what I do is I take all these groups and I put them on a single ring. And I found, in fact, I didn't run upstairs and get it out of my closet, but I have a belt organizer that I got at Target or Walmart or whatever, just any one of the big box stores, that kind of has long prongs on it. And I hang these on there. And so I can put this in my closet, and in, this much space, I have all of the colors that I need, that I've ever used. So these are all the reasons that I like thread drops. They are user-friendly, I think, in terms of labeling them. So one tip that I will share with you, though, is that each one of these thread drops, the cardboard is shiny and smooth on one side, and doesn't have a coating on the other side. And this is the side that I use to label it because it takes the ink better. When I first started using them, I was using the shiny smooth side. Somehow that just seemed more appealing, and I found that the ink did not dry well enough and it would just smear. But one of the complaints I read all the time about people who have bobbins is that the labels fall off, etc. And so again, that's one of the things that doesn't happen with this. And I've got a nice large area to write on, to put my symbol. Now this one doesn't have a symbol on it because right now it's not on one of my project rings. So that's one of the storage systems that's available. Again, my purpose here in my floss tubes and whatnot is not necessarily to sell you anything, but I'm also going to kind of present to you the system that I use and why over all the years it's the one that I have found accommodates all my needs. I'll mention all the other ones as well, like the bobbins and the floss bags. They're not my cup of tea, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. I think that they have advantages, but they also have disadvantages. And there's always that question of, storing the unused strands. Once you take out the 1 or 2 strands that you need, what do you do with the rest of them? But the thing that sells me more than anything else is being able to take my needle and just take 1 strand off, take off a second strand if I need to use 2 strands, and that sold me on this system. So at any rate, that's why I use them. This is one brand of thread drops. And as you can see, it comes with 30 pieces and 1 ring in the package. And I find that I supplement the rings that come in the package by simply picking them up at a big box office supply store. I find that that's the cheapest way to get them. And they come in a variety of sizes. I like getting the rather large one to put the floss on, to then store it, and then use the smaller ones for the projects. One other footnote before I totally leave this subject. A lot of people make their own thread drops by using one of the many punches that are available with paper crafts, and that's all fine and good. I would be careful as far as what type of cardboard you're using, and also you just need to balance out your time and your budget. There are people whose budget is such that they're going to spend the time making floss drops, and there are other people that say, with that amount of time, I'd rather be stitching. Again, that's all a matter of your own, where you are in your own personal lifestyle, and it's not a judgment at all. But I did want to point out to you that they are very easy to make. Again, just be careful of the type of cardboard that you use. Once again, the subject of gridding came up on several Facebook groups in the past couple of weeks. And I have some pretty strong opinions about it, and so I shared them in one group. But before I get into that, though, I want to share a story that I once heard that I think that you'll see how it applies to this. And I actually saw this on one of the boxes of Celestial Seasoning tea bags. I don't know if they still do this, but there was a time that on the side of the box there would be like a little fable or a story or just something sort of heartwarming. And it went something like this. A newlywed couple was approaching a holiday season, and the wife was going to bake a ham. And so the husband brought a ham home from the supermarket, and she cut the end of it off and put it in the roasting pan and roasted it. And he said, "Why did you cut off the end of the ham?" And she said, "Because that's the way my mother always did it." So the next time he was at his mother-in-law's house, he said, "By the way, your daughter, my wife, just made this ham for the first time, and she cut the end of it off to put it in the roasting pan, and I just was wondering why you do that." And she said, "Oh, because that's the way my mother always did it." So another holiday came along, and the family was together, and this time at the grandmother's house. And so when she served the baked ham, he saw that the end of it was cut off, and he said, "Finally, I can ask the source, why do you cut off the end of the ham before you bake it?" And she said, "So it will fit in my roasting pan." Now, I tell you this story because I feel like that when people post questions about gridding and people post their answers, that they're giving an incomplete answer. They're not really saying so much why they choose to grid. And it reminds me of that story every time. So what I said in response was that you're not doing anything wrong if you don't grid. You're not doing anything wrong if you do grid. But that I wish that people would realize that the need to grid or not has as much to do with the type of project as anything else. There is such a widespread interest in, or trend, if you want to call it that, of doing these massive projects, multiple pages, like 24, 40, 90 pages of cross-stitch designs that are full of what we call confetti stitches, which are when there's just like one little stitch here, there, and everywhere of a color. And they often have dozens and dozens of colors, if not in excess of 100 colors. This is so different from the type of cross-stitch that was first done when I became a cross-stitcher when I was in college in the 60s and 70s. I wasn't in college for 20 years. I just need to explain that. It was late 60s, early 70s. And then as cross-stitch really hit its stride in this country in the late 70s and early 80s. But at any rate, so I say this just to point out that what we think of as being cross-stitch has changed vastly. There really was no need to do gridding with the type of cross-stitch projects that we did in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s. So when people make statements like, a beginner might say, what is this gridding and do I need to do that? And somebody will inevitably, the response will be, I always grid, I always grid, I always grid, I never grid, I never grid. You can't just say, I cut off the end of the hand because that's the way my mother always did it. Find out why is it that you are doing what it is that you are doing. Are you gridding because you're doing a 97 page, 96 page, whatever project that has that's very complicated? Or are you doing a little Christmas ornament that's an elf that's in 3 colors? One project might need to be gridded, the other one might not. So please, for the sake of the person who's genuinely asking the question because they're curious or because they're new, please give them a complete answer. I think that will help clear up a lot about this and make it, frankly, less controversial. Just give a complete answer. That's really what I'm asking. I got a really good question from Charlene, who sent it to me by way of messenger, private message, direct message, whatever you want to call it, on Facebook. I hope she doesn't mind me sharing it with you here. She said, "Hi, I'm using a 32 count linen. How many strands of overdyed floss should I be using? The designer called for 2, but that was on 30 count linen. I normally use 1 strand when using 36. 2 seems thick, but 1 seems a little thin. What would you suggest?" So before I share with you how I answered her, I want to give you yet another analogy. I'm just full of these little stories today. Let's say you're driving in a really ferocious rainstorm, and it seems like that your windshield wipers are not keeping up. You're not getting a clear enough view to feel safe with your driving. 2 of the factors you have absolutely no control over: the weather and the capacity of your windshield wipers. But the thing that you can change is the speed by which you're driving. And you'll find that as you slow down, your windshield wipers are suddenly working. So you've solved your problem simply by slowing down. The slower you drive, the more effective your windshield wipers are without changing the setting at all. So I'm using that analogy here to get into an answer for Charlene's question. Because I also use 2 strands when I'm stitching on 30 count linen. And frankly, sometimes I've measured what's labeled as 30 count and it's been more like 31. So I'm thinking that 2 strands would be okay. But here's my answer. If 1 strand is not enough and 2 strands is too heavy, you might want to consider changing the fabric that you're using. So if you're not pleased with the results of your stitching, with whatever fabric it is, with the thread that you're stitching with, you can't change those things. What you can change is the fabric that you're stitching on, so that you find the fabric that matches the thread, because you're not always going to be able to find the thread that matches the fabric. And I hope that makes sense. I hope my analogy hasn't totally confused you. So think about that, because you have a much broader range of fabric counts than you have the weight of floss threads. So keep that in mind. Also, the weight of the floss threads, I think, do vary from brand to brand. And I think within some brands, it even, you'll find a variance in terms of the coverage that you get between colors. When people are selling the overdyed flosses, they're starting with a base of a manufactured floss like DMC or Cosmo or whatever. And then once you are dye it, I think sometimes those threads actually do stitch up as a little bit heavier than a thread that's not overdyed. So I hope that helps a little bit. I think that's a wrap for today, and I hope that you have enjoyed this as much as I have. I love my planning sessions and making the tapes and editing them and getting them all ready to share with you. So I hope that wherever you are, that you can stitch happy and stay safe, and I'll see you next week.